I never thought that one day I'd tell this story, but after everything that's happened, I feel I need to share what I've experienced. Maybe by telling it, I can lighten the load a little. It all started when I was admitted to St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital in a small town in England. I, John, was going through a difficult period in my life. The stress of work and personal problems had led me to a nervous breakdown. My friends and family insisted that I seek help, and that's how I ended up there. Right from the start, something seemed strange about the place. It wasn't just the old architecture and the dimly lit corridors. There was a constant feeling of oppression in the air. The first few days were relatively quiet, although unsettling. The routine was very strict, and I spent most of the time trying to pull myself together. That's when I met Nurse Mary and Dr. Albert, the psychiatrist in charge of my case. Mary was a kind woman, with eyes that always seemed full of concern. From the start, she treated me with great care and attention, which made me feel a little safer in that environment. Dr. Albert, on the other hand, was a man of few words and a cold expression. He always seemed to be analyzing everything around him, and I couldn't decipher whether he was trustworthy or not. The first few nights, I began to hear screams coming from other rooms, or perhaps from the corridors. They echoed in the silence of the early morning, making my heart race. When I mentioned it to Mary, she asked me not to pay any attention and to rest. She said it could be the result of my own fragile mental state. But the more time passed, the more I was sure that something terrible was happening there. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I saw shadows moving down the corridor through a crack in my bedroom door. They were quick and almost imperceptible, but they were there. I told Mary about it the next day, and she became visibly tense. She asked me not to trust Dr. Albert, but didn't explain why. Her warning only increased my unease. The nightmares started soon after. I dreamt of endless corridors full of doors opening onto torture rooms and grotesque experiments. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, not knowing if it was all a dream or a premonition of what was to come. Every day, the line between reality and illusion became thinner. Then came the day of my first experimental treatment session. I was taken to a room in the basement where I had never been before. Dr. Albert was there, ready to administer a substance that he said was part of my treatment. Mary accompanied me, but seemed even more worried than before. I didn't know that that session would be the beginning of my real nightmare. That night, after the first session, the screams seemed even louder. I was in my room trying to forget what had happened in the treatment room, when I heard those terrifying sounds again. The screams echoed through the corridors, mixed with cries and murmurs. I closed my eyes and covered my head with the pillow, trying to block out the sound. But it was impossible. The next day, I asked some of the patients about the screams, but they all seemed frightened and refused to talk. I noticed that many of them had deep circles under their eyes and an empty look, as if they were dead inside. That made me even more worried. Then one night, I saw something I would never forget. Through the small window in my bedroom door, I saw shadows moving down the corridor. They were fast and seemed to glide across the floor, almost as if they were part of the building itself. I stood still, trying to understand whether it was real or just another hallucination caused by the treatment. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. Mary kept warning me about Dr. Albert. In a quick conversation, she told me not to trust him at all. There was something in the way she spoke, a genuine fear that I couldn't ignore. It only made my anxiety grow. What was going on in that place? Why did she seem so desperate? The nightmares started to get worse. I dreamt of the hospital corridors, but they were different, distorted. The doors that once led to ordinary rooms now opened onto scenes of torture and suffering. I saw patients being subjected to horrific experiments, screaming in pain while Dr. Albert watched impassively. I would wake up in a cold sweat with the feeling that I was no longer safe even in my dreams. It was during one of these nightmarish nights that I found a diary hidden in a drawer in my bedroom. It was an old notebook, its pages yellowed by time. When I opened it, I saw that it belonged to a former patient. He was detailing his experiences in hospital, talking about the painful treatments and the things he had seen. The account sounded incredibly familiar to my own nightmares. With each page, my apprehension grew. The patient described cruel experiments in which Dr. Albert and other doctors tried to manipulate the patient's minds and bodies in unimaginable ways. There were mentions of disappearances, patients coming in for sessions and never being seen again. Every word seemed to confirm my greatest fears. I was trapped in a place where horrible things happened. And worst of all, I didn't know who to trust. Mary was my only ally, but even she seemed to fear for her own life. Reality was turning into an endless nightmare, and I had no idea how to get out of the situation. The first experimental treatment session was a dark milestone in my hospital stay. I was taken back to the room in the basement, the same one where I'd had the previous session. Dr. Albert was there, his gaze cold and impassive. Mary was beside him, visibly tense. Dr. Albert explained to me that the substance he was going to administer was part of an experimental therapy. I was nervous, but I tried to convince myself that it was for my own good. When the substance entered my body, I felt an intense burning sensation that spread through my limbs. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to move. The hallucinations began almost immediately. I saw shadows dancing on the walls, deformed faces emerging from the floor, and I felt an icy presence around me. The visions were so vivid that I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I heard voices whispering. I heard voices whispering things I couldn't understand, and a feeling of absolute terror overtook me. While I was immersed in these hallucinations, I began to see scenes of mutilated patients. They were strapped to operating tables, their faces contorted with pain. The visions were horrific, and I felt every cut and every scream as if it were real. The images blended together, and I no longer knew whether I was dreaming or awake. When the session finally ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Dr. Albert seemed satisfied with the results, but Mary couldn't hide her concern. She helped me back to my room and tried to calm me down, telling me that I needed to rest. But how could I rest after what I had seen? That night, as I tried to process everything, I realized that something had to be done. I couldn't keep going through those sessions without understanding what was really going on. I decided to investigate further, starting with the diary I had found. Perhaps there I would find more answers. Each page of the diary revealed more horrors. The former patient detailed horrific experiments, many of which resulted in death or worse. There were descriptions of rituals and practices that seemed straight out of a nightmare. And the most disturbing thing, many of the patients who underwent these treatments were never seen again. It was clear that I needed to get out of that place. But with each passing day, it seemed that my chances of escape were diminishing. Mary, sensing my desperation, began to help me more actively. She shared information whenever she could, even though she was constantly afraid of being discovered. Our conversations were quick and full of secrets, but little by little I was piecing together a horrible puzzle. The psychological terror I was being subjected to was slowly destroying me. Every session, every vision, every scream heard in the middle of the night contributed to my state of paranoia. I knew I had to find a way out of there before it was too late, but every step towards the truth seemed to take me deeper into the abyss of horror that was St. Elizabeth's Hospital. As my mind struggled to hold itself together, I continued to explore the hospital. One night, when everyone seemed to be asleep, I left my room and began to investigate the corridors. The atmosphere was heavy and the silence oppressive. My hands were shaking, but I needed to understand what was going on there. In this search, I found a diary hidden on a shelf in a storage room. It was just another notebook, with the same pages yellowed by time. The former owner had written down every detail of his stay there, and what I read made my blood run cold. He described experiments that defied ethics and morality, carried out with a coldness that could only belong to someone deeply disturbed. The notes spoke of patients who simply disappeared, taken away for treatment sessions from which they never returned. The author of the diary reported seeing bodies being removed during the night, and that the screams I heard were only part of the horror taking place within those walls. What terrified me most was finding any mention of Dr. Albert, who seemed to be the main person responsible for these macabre experiments. Determined to find out more, I started looking through the hospital archives. I hoped to find some evidence that I could use to confront Dr. Albert or to convince the authorities to investigate what was going on there. What I found was even worse than I had imagined. The files contained treatment records detailing methods that seemed straight out of a horror movie. Each record revealed a little more about the nature of the experiments. They involved mental, physical, and even spiritual manipulation of the patients. It seemed that Dr. Albert and his colleagues were trying to transcend the boundaries of science and medicine, entering supernatural territory. There were mentions of ancient rituals and substances that shouldn't exist in the modern world. My research led me to an even more disturbing discovery. Many of the patients listed in the archives had simply disappeared from the records, as if they had never existed. I knew this meant that they had either been eliminated or subjected to something so horrible that they had to be erased from the hospital's history. As I read, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was being watched too. The hospital was full of cameras, and I was sure that someone knew I was investigating. The shadows in the corridors weren't just a figment of my imagination. Something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to act. Mary, sensing my growing paranoia, began to share more details. She confirmed my suspicions that the missing patients were used in forbidden experiments, and that many of them died in terrible ways. Every conversation with her was a mixture of relief and despair. I had an ally, but I also knew that we were running out of time. Mary's diary, files, and warnings formed a clear picture of the horror that was St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I needed to find a way out of there before I became the next name crossed off the register. But how could I escape from a place where every shadow seemed alive and every door hid a deadly secret? After everything I discovered, I was even more determined to get out of that hospital. But things got worse. Dr. Albert increased the frequency of the treatment sessions, and each one was more terrible than the last. It was as if he knew I was close to uncovering his secrets and wanted to break me before I could do anything. During these sessions, I began to lose my grip on reality. The hallucinations became constant and were no longer limited to the sessions. I saw terrifying things even when I was awake, like the spirits of dead patients following me down the corridors, whispering words of despair and pain. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the result of the experiments. One day, after a particularly brutal session, I went to the equipment room, where I had never been before. It was Mary who showed me the way, even though I knew the risks I was taking. Inside, I saw things that defied all my understanding of science and medicine. There were machines that seemed straight out of a nightmare, designed to inflict pain and manipulate the mind in unimaginable ways. I discovered that the experiments weren't just to study the human mind. Dr. Albert was trying to reanimate the dead. There were notes and diagrams detailing procedures to bring back to life those who had died at his hands. And it wasn't just about reviving the bodies, but also about controlling them, transforming them into something more than human. I began to realize that the spirits I was seeing weren't hallucinations. They were the patients who had died during these macabre experiments. They were trapped between the world of the living and the dead, tortured by Dr. Albert's attempts to manipulate them. The visions of mutilation and pain I had were memories of these tormented souls trying to show me the horror they had been through. Mary was becoming increasingly desperate. She knew that our window of opportunity to escape was closing fast. Every day, Dr. Albert's presence became more oppressive, as if he could sense our resistance. The shadows in the corridors, which had once seemed like mere daydreams of my troubled mind, now had more defined shapes, and their empty gazes followed me wherever I went. I knew I had to do something before it was too late. Each treatment session left me weaker and closer to complete madness. The voices of the spirits of the dead patients became louder and more desperate, as if they knew that I was trying to help them, but that my time was running out. Reality was crumbling around me, and I was no longer sure if I would be able to escape this nightmare. But one thing was certain: I had to try. If not for myself, then for those who died in that place, whose souls would never find peace as long as Dr. Albert's experiments continued. My sanity and my life were at stake, and every decision I made could be my last. Mary and I knew we had to act fast. Every day at St. Elizabeth's Hospital became more dangerous, and our margin for escape became smaller. Mary was risking everything to help me. She began to pass on more information, details that could help us better understand what was happening, and, hopefully, find a way out. She showed me a hiding place where she kept some documents she had obtained over the years. They were medical records detailing the supernatural experiments conducted by Dr. Albert and his team. As I leafed through the papers, I felt a mixture of horror and fascination. Every line was proof of the doctor's madness and cruelty. The experiments not only involved mental and physical manipulation, but also rituals that seemed closer to black magic than science. Mary and I spent nights examining the records. We discovered that Dr. Albert had been trying to reanimate the dead for years, using techniques that defied any rational explanation. He believed he could create an army of the undead controlled by his will. Many of the patients who underwent these experiments ended up dead, and the spirits now roamed the hospital, trapped between life and death. It was then that Mary made a shocking revelation. She told me that Dr. Albert had been dead for years. At first I thought it was another hallucination, but she showed me an old hospital record proving that he had died mysteriously during one of his experiments. Whatever was controlling the hospital now, it wasn't the living Dr. Albert, but something much more sinister. The spirits of dead patients were beginning to appear more frequently. They weren't just fleeting visions, now their presence was almost tangible. I could feel the chill emanating from them, hear their whispers more clearly. It felt like they were trying to guide us, to show us something that could help us escape. One night, during one of our searches for more information, we found a secret room. It was a hidden laboratory full of strange equipment and ancient symbols drawn on the walls. There, we saw evidence of the rituals that Dr. Albert and his assistants performed. There were vials with unknown substances and instruments that seemed more designed to cause pain than to heal. As we explored the room, I felt an icy presence behind me. I turned and saw the spirit of a patient, with a mutilated body and eyes full of pain. He didn't speak, but his expression said it all. We were at the center of a nightmare created by experiments that violated the laws of life and death. The patient raised his hand, pointing to a corner of the room. There we found a notebook that appeared to be Dr. Albert's diary. The diary contained disturbing notes about his attempts to defy death and control the dead. He believed that by mastering these powers, he could transcend humanity and become something more. Each page of the diary revealed the depth of his madness and the horror of his experiments. With that evidence, we knew we had what we needed to expose the truth. But we also knew that our escape wouldn't be easy. The hospital was alive, and the evil that controlled it would not let us leave so easily. The situation was getting worse every day. The nightly treatment sessions became an unbearable torment. Dr. Albert seemed to have intensified the experiments, as if he wanted to break what was left of my sanity. One night, I was taken to the underground room again. The atmosphere was even colder and darker than before. The darkness seemed denser, almost palpable. During that session, something different happened. Dr. Albert began to perform rituals that I had never seen before. He muttered words in a strange language while symbols glowed on the walls. I felt a dark energy surround me, tightening my chest and making it difficult to breathe. The visions I had were the most horrific yet, the bodies of patients being tortured, their screams echoing in my mind. The spirits of the dead patients began to manifest physically in the room. They weren't just visions. They were now there, in front of me, with their mutilated bodies and faces contorted with pain. They came closer, trying to touch me, their icy hands burning my skin. Absolute terror gripped me, and all I wanted was to escape from that hellish room. When the session finally ended, I was taken back to my room, but the torment didn't stop. The visions continued even when I was awake. The spirits followed me through the corridors, whispering incomprehensible things but full of despair. I was on the verge of madness, feeling more and more trapped in the nightmare of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Mary was desperate. She told me that she had seen Dr. Albert perform similar rituals with other patients, and that many of them were never seen again. The fear in her eyes was clear, but she refused to give up. We knew we had to act fast, or the next missing person would be me. One night, Mary and I decided to try to escape. We carefully planned every step. We waited until the hospital was at its most silent, the screams of the patients fading into the distance. We left my room and started walking down the corridors, trying not to make any noise. But the hospital seemed to be alive. The shadows in the corridors moved strangely, almost as if they were watching us. At every step, we felt a shadowy presence following us, the invisible eyes of Dr. Albert watching us. We reached the underground exit, where we thought we could escape. But when we got there, the door was blocked. Desperate, we looked for another way out, but it seemed that the hospital knew our plans. We ran through the corridors, but all the exits were locked. The shadows seemed to surround us, and the spirits of the dead patients became more aggressive, their appearances more frequent and disturbing. Every step seemed to take us deeper into the nightmare, and the hope of escape faded. The horror of the night sessions and the constant presence of the spirits left us in a constant state of panic. I knew we needed to find a quick solution, but with every attempt to escape, the hospital seemed to pull us back like a trap with no way out. Mary and I were determined to try again. After our first failed attempt, we knew that the hospital was aware of our movements, but we couldn't give up. We needed to be more careful, faster. We planned a new escape, this time with even more attention to detail. We waited until the hospital plunged into the darkness of dawn. We left our rooms and moved silently through the corridors. Every step was a battle against fear and paranoia. We felt Dr. Albert's invisible eyes watching us as if he were everywhere. The shadows seemed to follow us, sliding across the walls and floor, increasing our sense of desperation. With every corridor we crossed, the feeling of being watched intensified. The screams and murmurs of the other patients mingled with the whispers of the spirits of the dead. The tension was palpable, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. Mary held my hand, trying to give me some courage, but I could see the fear in her eyes. As we neared one of the emergency exits, our hearts were filled with a fragile hope. But just like last time, we found the door locked. We couldn't believe we were trapped again. We tried to force the door, but it seemed that the whole hospital was conspiring to keep us inside. We heard footsteps approaching and whispering voices getting closer and closer. In the midst of our desperation, we found a small window at the end of the corridor. It was our last chance. We started trying to open it, but it was jammed. As we struggled with the window, the shadows around us became denser, almost palpable. We could feel an evil presence approaching. With a final effort, we managed to open the window enough for me to get through. Mary helped me up, and soon I was outside, feeling the cold night air. As I was helping Mary out, I heard a scream that made my blood run cold. I turned around and saw the spirit of a dead patient, his eyes full of despair, trying to reach us. He seemed to be begging for help, but we didn't have time. I managed to pull Mary out, and we ran away from the hospital without looking back. As we ran through the darkness, we could hear the screams and whispers diminishing, but the terror remained inside us. We felt that somehow we were still being followed. Finally, we reached a safer area of the city, but the fear didn't leave us. The feeling that something was watching us continued to haunt us. Mary and I knew that we couldn't just forget what happened at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. We needed to tell our story, expose the horrors we had experienced, and try to prevent more people from suffering the same fate. But for now, the only thing we could do was try to survive and stay away from the shadows that still seemed to haunt us. After managing to escape from the hospital, Mary and I hid out in a small motel nearby. We needed a place to think and decide our next steps. We were still shaking, and the terror of the past few weeks seemed to follow us like a lingering shadow. That night, while we were trying to rest, Mary made a disturbing discovery. She had brought with her Dr. Albert's diary, which we had found in the secret laboratory. We decided to read it more carefully in the hope of finding something that would help us understand everything. What we found was even more shocking than anything we had ever seen. The diary revealed that Dr. Albert had been dead for years, but his spirit continued to carry out the experiments. He had found a way to link himself to the hospital, keeping his consciousness alive even after death. His obsession with defying death and controlling the dead had transcended the barrier between the world of the living and the dead. With each page we read, the truth became clearer and more terrifying. Dr. Albert had become something more than human, a being who existed between the two worlds, using the hospital as his domain. The spirits of the dead patients were his victims, trapped eternally in his nightmare. While we were reading, I began to feel an icy presence in the room. I looked around and saw shadows moving along the walls. I knew it wasn't a hallucination. Dr. Albert was watching us, even from a distance. Mary and I tried to ignore the sensation, but the presence became stronger, almost suffocating. Then something happened that made my heart stop. I had a vision of Dr. Albert himself, his face pale and distorted by death, looking directly at me. He didn't say anything, but his gaze was enough to fill me with absolute terror. The vision only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to understand that he knew where we were. Mary and I knew we weren't safe. We needed to get out of there, but there was nowhere to run. Dr. Albert's spirit was connected to the hospital and somehow managed to reach us. The revelation that he had been dead for years and still controlled everything was devastating. Dr. Albert's presence grew stronger, and the visions began to intensify. We could see the spirits of the dead patients around us, their hands outstretched, their eyes full of despair. It was as if they wanted to show us something, to warn us of what was to come. It was then that I had the clearest and most disturbing vision of all. I saw my own body in the experiment room, being manipulated by Dr. Albert's spirit. I felt every cut, every pain, as if it were real. I woke up screaming, feeling like my soul was being ripped out of my body. Mary tried to calm me down, but I knew that time was running out. We had to do something before Dr. Albert captured us for good. Every minute that passed, the line between the world of the living and the dead became more blurred. We were trapped in a nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. I woke up from one of my worst nightmares in a cold sweat and gasping for breath. Mary was beside me trying to calm me down, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We knew we were racing against time. Every minute that passed brought us closer to Dr. Albert's influence. With the revelations from the diary still fresh in our minds, we realized that physically escaping from the hospital wouldn't be enough. We needed to find a way to sever Dr. Albert's connection with the world of the living. But how could we do that against such a powerful spirit? Our last attempt was to return to the hospital, a desperate but necessary act. We believed that the only way to stop Dr. Albert was to destroy the objects he used in his rituals. We knew we were taking a risk, but there was no other option. On returning to the hospital, we sneaked through the dark corridors, the atmosphere now even more oppressive than before. The feeling of being watched was constant, but there was no time for hesitation. We reached the secret room where the rituals were performed. The place was full of strange items and ancient symbols. Mary and I began to destroy everything we found: jars, amulets, old books. Each broken item seemed to release a dark energy, and we could hear the distant cries of disturbed spirits. But that didn't stop us. We continued, determined to put an end to the source of Dr. Albert's power. In the midst of the destruction, I felt an icy presence behind me. I turned and saw Dr. Albert's spirit, his face contorted with hatred. He advanced on us, but before he could reach us, Mary found an old book, clearly more important than the others. It had intricate symbols on the cover and exuded a dark energy. Mary began tearing the pages out of the book. Each destroyed page seemed to weaken Dr. Albert's presence. He screamed, an inhuman sound that echoed throughout the hospital. The spirit squirmed, and for a moment I thought we would make it. But then something happened. The hospital began to shake. The walls seemed to pulse with an evil energy. The spirits of the dead patients appeared around us, their faces expressing both pain and gratitude. They began to approach Dr. Albert as if they wanted to take him with them. His form began to fade, screaming in agony as he was dragged away by the spirits. With one last scream, Dr. Albert disappeared, and the hospital fell silent. Mary and I were exhausted, but we knew we had succeeded. We had destroyed the bond that held Dr. Albert to the hospital. But as we left the room, something inside me knew that the nightmare wasn't over yet. When we finally left the hospital, the feeling of relief was momentary. The air seemed lighter, but the darkness inside me remained. I knew that somehow Dr. Albert's presence still followed me. We couldn't go back to our normal lives. The terror we had experienced had left a permanent mark on us. Mary and I separated shortly afterwards, unable to cope with the horrors we had shared. We each tried to rebuild our lives, but the shadows of the past never left us. The story of St. Elizabeth's Hospital became a scar on our souls, a constant reminder that some terrors never completely disappear. And so the darkness continued to haunt us, like a dark echo of what we experienced in that cursed hospital.